Hello and welcome into this week's episode of the Everyday Strength Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Higley. At some point, everyone hears this very similar sounding thing. They say, wait until you're 30, wait until you're 40, wait until you're 50, right? Wait until you have a real job. Wait till you are married and have kids. And it's always said that same way, like it's a warning. Like there's this point looming where everything just is going to start to go downhill, where your body is going to slow down, your energy levels are going to drop off, you're going to gain weight, you're going to lose strength. You no longer have time to work out, and that's just the way it is. And many people just accept that. They assume that that decline is just part of the deal, that it's biological, that it's inevitable. But if you actually stop and think about it, what's really supposed to be happening there? Do you suddenly gain weight because of some inherent biological process? Do you get weaker because your muscles just decide to stop working as well? Or is something else going on entirely? When you look around, you'll see people in their 40s and 50s who are in better shape than most people in their 20s. They're stronger, they're leaner, they have better conditioning, they're more disciplined with their training. There's so many examples of this today. And so clearly, it's not just an age thing. And that's what I want to talk about in this episode. I don't want to speak from a motivational standpoint, but instead from a physiological and a practical one. Because yes, some things do change as you get older, but most of what people experience as aging isn't actually aging. It's the result of how they're living. It's the habits that they fall into, the mentality that they've developed. It's the result of what I would call a lifestyle drift. And once you understand that, if you can separate what actually changes biologically from what changes behaviorally, then you'll realize that maybe you don't have to suffer from what so many people have warned you about. A lot of the decline that people accept is optional. Now, before we go any further, we have to be honest about something, and that is that aging is real. I'm not claiming it's not. I'm not claiming that it's some made-up myth. There are physiological changes that occur over time, and pretending that they don't exist makes this whole conversation fall apart. But what's important is understanding what actually decreases and what actually changes to your body, why it changes, and how much that really matters. Now, one of the most consistent changes you'll see is a gradual decline in your maximum heart rate. This is largely driven by changes in the heart's intrinsic pacing and electrical conduction system. So it tends to decrease in a fairly predictable way over time, regardless of how trained you are, what your training status is. But the key is that while max heart rate declines, it's rarely the limiting factor for most people's performance. People aren't operating anywhere near their physiological ceiling to begin with. Now, you'll also see a decline in VO2 max over time, especially in people who are not training at all. And this is where things can get a little bit more layered, right? VO2 max is influenced by several components, and that is your heart's ability to pump blood, your muscles' ability to extract and use oxygen, and the overall efficiency of that entire system. Now, with aging, you can see reductions in stroke volume. You can see slight decreases in mitochondrial capacity and density, and changes in peripheral oxygen extraction. But again, this is heavily influenced by behavior. People who continue to train, especially with a mix of aerobic work and higher intensity efforts, can maintain a high level of this aerobic capacity well into their 40s, 50s, and beyond. Even highly trained individuals tend to see about a 5 to 10% decline per decade if their training is reduced. But that decline can be dramatically blunted when training is maintained. And then a third area is rate of force development. This is your body's ability to produce force quickly. And this is driven more by neural factors than anything else. So things like motor unit recruitment, firing rates, muscle coordination. If you stop exposing your body to higher velocity and higher force outputs, then those qualities will fade. It's not that they're gone forever, but you're no longer asking your body to express them. And then another one here is recovery. People tend to point to this. You'll often hear that recovery just gets worse with age. And there is some truth to that. But I think a lot of it's overstated. There might be slight changes in tissue turnover or how quickly your body can bounce back from very high levels of stress. But more often than not, what people are experiencing isn't aging related. It's just accumulated fatigue from poor sleep, from higher stresses throughout their life, through inconsistent training and less attention being paid towards how they're managing their workload. Great example here is for people who maybe haven't been consistently training, they jump right into a workout and they treat it like it's something that they do every single day, when in reality, they haven't exercised in weeks, months, maybe longer. And so they'll do this high intensity workout, 25 sets of legs or a bunch of arm movements, right? And then they wake up the next day and they're so sore that they don't want to get out of bed. And then they attribute this to just getting older, to not being able to recover as well as they did when they were in their prime 5, 10, 15 years ago. The issue here is that their poor recovery is being blamed on just getting older, when in reality, it's because they didn't progress at all to being able to do that workout. They jumped right in with their buddies and they hammered away. They felt great doing it, but then they're paying for it tomorrow. Again, this points to the importance of consistency and following a properly designed training program. Now, ultimately, aging does move the needle. It shifts things slightly, but it's not the primary driver of the performance decline that most people experience. The reality is most people aren't being limited by their physiology. Instead, they're limited by how they're living their life. So if aging isn't the main driver of this decline, then what is? And this is where we'll get into something that I call lifestyle drift. And lifestyle drift is exactly what it sounds like. It's not one big decision culminating event. It's a slow, almost unnoticeable movement away from the behaviors that used to support your performance. The things that used to keep you leaner and strong and getting less winded just doing these typical everyday activities. Now, unless you suffer some acute injury or some acute event that changes everything, you don't just wake up one day and decide to stop being active. You just start moving a little less. You take fewer steps throughout the day. You sit more and you stand less. You drive more. You stop doing the small things that used to add up over time. And training is the same way, right? It goes from a structured and consistent part of your life to a flexible, inconsistent, and eventually, for a lot of people, it just disappears. It disappears entirely, or it becomes more random. It becomes more of the exception than the rule, right? They do a workout here, a group fitness class there, maybe something on the weekend if there's some time to do it. Their sleep starts to get worse, not because your body suddenly forgot how to sleep, right? But because your schedule has changed. Maybe now you stay up a little bit later. You wake up a little bit earlier. There's more stress, more deadlines, more responsibilities, more things that are constantly pulling at your time and your attention. And then over time, your body weight starts to creep up. Not all at once, but just a few pounds here and there. A slower pace of life, a little less movement, a little more food. And over time, it adds up. And there's data to support this. People tend to gain small amounts of weight each year, especially around the holidays and the winter months. And most of it, unfortunately, never comes off. So over 10, 20 years, now this adds up. Intensity in their training disappears. People stop running, they stop sprinting, they stop lifting heavy. They stop pushing themselves in any meaningful way. Everything for them becomes moderate. It's something that's comfortable, it's manageable. And then on top of that, it's sporadic. And none of that is caused directly by aging. Now it's a shift in your environment. It's a shift in your priorities, a shift in how you structure your day-to-day. I can speak to this personally. You go from being in environments where activity is built in Things like athletic training in high school and college, sports, right? Playing sports whenever you're in high school. Whenever you're in college, right? You're being on your feet. You're walking across campus to get to class. You're going out with friends. You're going bowling, mini golf. These little things that didn't seem like much at the time, but they really were. And now you're sitting at a desk for hours. You're choosing the closest parking spot at the grocery store because you're in a hurry to get home after work. You want to get in, get out. You're spending weekends in the house in front of the TV instead of going out with friends. You've got work, you've got family, you've got travel. Your schedule isn't your own anymore. And if you don't deliberately carve out the time to train, then it's just not going to happen. And that's lifestyle drift. And over time, it compounds. Because the body adapts to what you give it. If you give it a little less movement, less intensity, less structure, then it's going to give you less of that capacity in return. Which is why when people look at themselves at 35 or 40 and they feel like everything has just all of a sudden declined, it feels like it's because they are getting older and they're aging. It's chalked up to that, just I'm getting older, right? But in reality, they're experiencing this accumulation of years of just small behavioral changes. And that leads directly in to where this really starts to happen. Right? When you step back and you look at this whole thing, right? This decline that most people experience, it's not just a random occurrence. It shows up around very specific points in life. Those points have nothing to do with your physiology. They have everything to do with your environment. For many people, it starts when that organized activity disappears. Like I said, high school sports come to an end. Maybe you're fortunate enough to play in, sports in college. Those come to an end. And then with that, you lose that built-in structure. You lose the expectation that you're going to have to show up and perform. Up to that point, activity wasn't something that you had to think about. It was just a part of your day. And then you graduate, you move into the workforce, right? Now you're often sitting more. You're on a more rigid schedule that revolves around work and not training. Your day is less physically demanding. And unless you go out of your way to carve out time to train, then nothing is going to force you to do it. Then life keeps moving. You get into a serious relationship. You get married. You have kids. And now your time isn't just limited. It's spoken for, right? Your priorities shift as they should. But if your training doesn't adapt to be able to fit that new structure, then it's going to get pushed out. And then career progression just continues to add another layer, right? More responsibility. Now we've got longer hours, more stress, more decisions, and less mental bandwidth. So what happens, right? You don't suddenly lose your ability to be fit, but you lose the structure that supported it. And if you don't replace that structure with something that's intentional, and most people don't, then that slow decline is going to become the default. People end up thinking that something has changed inside their body, that their physiology is now different, when in reality, everything around their body changed, and their training just never adjusted to match it. Now, at this point, it's worth addressing a few of the things that people blame on aging that just aren't accurate. And we've touched on these a little bit, but one of the biggest ones is metabolism. Okay, you'll hear people say that once they hit their 30s or their 40s, their metabolism slowed down and that's why they gained weight, right? But when you actually look at some of the data that's out there, that argument doesn't really hold up. Really great studies showed that, energy expenditure is remarkably stable across the lifespan. There isn't some dramatic drop off when you hit 30 years old that suddenly makes you gain fat. What's really happening is that people now have accumulated years of that small weight gain without really ever reversing it. They've lost muscle tissue, that metabolically active tissue that no longer increases caloric expenditure. What does change is behavior. Okay, people move less. They burn fewer calories. They don't train as often, and they become more inconsistent. An intake of food often creeps up, much without awareness. And that combination, that lower output, that slightly higher intake, drives weight gain over time, not some sudden metabolic shutdown. Muscle loss is another one. People assume that once you get past a certain age, you're just going to start hemorrhaging muscle, no matter what you do, right? But that's not how our bodies work. Okay, muscle loss is largely driven by disuse and insufficient stimulus. When we stop lifting, and if you stop exposing your body to that meaningful resistance, your protein intake is low, then yes, you're going to lose muscle. But that's not all due to aging, acting in isolation. It's just a lack of stimulus. The same goes with our conditioning work. You don't just lose your aerobic capacity because you turn 35, right? You lose it because you stopped training it. Your body is extremely responsive to aerobic work when it's applied consistently. But if that stimulus disappears, then the system regresses. And when you put all of that together, the pattern here is more obvious. Okay, the aging doesn't force that decline. It just exposes the poor systems. If your training, your movement, your nutrition, and your overall structure start to slip, then aging will make that much more apparent. But it's not the root cause. And when you understand that, it changes how you approach all of this. Because now the question isn't how do I fight aging? The question becomes how do I rebuild the habits that once kept me young as I get older? So once you understand that most of this comes down to how you're living and how you're training, then the next question is more straightforward, right? What actually works to support these habits? And it's not complicated. It just requires consistency and intent, like everything else. At the center of all of this is strength training. That's the biggest non-negotiable. I spoke about the importance of resistance training and strength training in a recent podcast, and I would recommend giving that a listen. But to summarize, 2 to 4 days per week, consistently over long periods of time. It's not random workouts, not constantly changing variations and changing the direction with your training, but structured programming that maintains exposure to meaningful loading. Because strength underpins so much of what we are talking about here. Okay, it preserves muscle. It maintains your ability to produce force. It gives you a buffer against a lot of the things that people associate with aging. Alongside that, you need some form of conditioning. This is why every program I write has conditioning. This doesn't have to be random high-intensity workouts that are thrown in, here and there, but it needs to be something that's a little more structured, a base of aerobic work where you're actually developing your capacity. And then on top of that, some higher intensity layered in. And that's what keeps your engine where it needs to be. It's important to mention body composition. This matters too, whether people like it or not. And not from an aesthetic standpoint, but from a physiological one. Right? If body weight is slowly creeping up year after year, then that's going to impact everything. Right? Your movement, your conditioning, your joint stress, your overall health. And keeping body weight in check over time goes a long way. And then there's intensity. And this is where a lot of people will fall off. Okay, they stop lifting heavy. They stop moving fast. They stop doing anything that actually challenges them. They claim it's to fight off getting hurt, right? Because as you get older, you don't want to get hurt. And the older you are, right, then we start to shift to this moderate type of training. But in reality, the thing that keeps you younger for longer is the heavy stuff that got you strong to begin with. For most people, everything becomes moderate, becomes comfortable, becomes manageable. And over time, that's going to erode capacity. You don't have to train recklessly, but you do have to continue exposing your body to higher levels of effort and do so with heavy compound movements. Things like squats, deadlift, bench press, pull-ups, dips. These movements that give you the most return for your time, which matters more as you get older, as life gets busier. But don't just go from 0 to 100. Okay, the key is progressing back to that point if you aren't already there. And this is where things like kettlebells and dumbbells and different tools that are different than the barbell come into play. Because you can work on getting back to the squat with a kettlebell goblet squat. You can get back to bench pressing using dumbbells. These tools tend to offer more range of motion. They are better on nagging joints. And now layered underneath all of that is your day-to-day lifestyle. And this is where it's either supported or it's undermined. You can't expect to train 4 hours a week and then be completely inactive the other 160 plus hours and think that doesn't matter. The small things add up. Things like parking farther away instead of right up front, walking more throughout the day, taking a walk at lunch, getting outside after dinner, and playing with your kids instead of sitting on the sideline, using a standing desk or even a walking pad if that's an option for you. None of this is flashy. None of it actually feels like training, but it's the baseline that your body expects. And when you combine all of that, right, the consistent strength training, the structured conditioning, reasonable body composition, maintaining some level of intensity, and just moving more throughout the day, you're going to end up with something that's actually sustainable for you. Something that fits into real life. Because at this stage, it's not about doing more, but it's about being more intentional with what you're already doing. Now, with all of that said, there are some things that, some different adjustments that do make sense as you get older. It's not because you're fragile, but because you're being more deliberate with your training. And one of the biggest ones is how you prepare to train. You can't just walk into the gym cold, throw a couple plates on the bar, and expect everything to feel good, to feel great. You need a little more time to get things moving. The tissues tend to tolerate load better when they're prepared, especially as you accumulate more training years. Your joints need to be taken through full ranges of motion. The patterns that you're going to train need to be cleaned up, and you need to gradually build into the session. And this is where something like a structured warm-up actually matters for you. Moving through those key patterns, opening up the range of motion where you need it, integrating that all into actual movement, and then building some level of readiness before you get into the main work. And that's essentially how I think about the prime warm-up framework. You're preparing the body to do what you're about to ask it to do. And if you do that consistently, then a lot of the issues that people run into, that little tightness, that little stiffness, little tweaks here and there, then those will start to go away. Recovery is another area where people tend to notice this difference. But again, it's more about managing it than limiting it. You may not be able to stack high intensity days back to back the same way that you could when you were younger and you had fewer responsibilities and better sleep and less stress. But that doesn't mean that you can't train hard. It just means you need to be a little bit more thoughtful with how you're organizing your week. Where you place those higher intensity sessions, how you space things out. The volume is similar in that you don't necessarily need more, and in a lot of cases you probably need less volume, but you need better, more targeted work, higher quality sets, less exercises and just adding junk volume that just adds to fatigue without really driving any form of adaptation. But through all of this, right, the most important thing stays the same. The standard doesn't change. You still need to lift with that intent and that consistency. You still need to move well. You still need to challenge yourself. You're just going to have to adjust how you get there, not lowering the bar. Now, at some point, there is a shift that happens. When you're younger, activity is built into your life. You have practice. You have training. You have games, lifting sessions. There's structure whether you created it or not. You don't really have to think about it. You just show up. But as you get older, that disappears. No one is telling you that you have to train. No one is expecting you to be in shape. There's no external structure that is forcing you to maintain it. And that's the point where things change, because now it becomes a decision. You either choose to continue and keep training, to keep moving, to keep pushing yourself, or you don't. And for a lot of people, unfortunately, that's where things start to slip. Not because they can't do it, but because it just stops becoming a priority. It gets replaced by something that's more convenient, by something that's more comfortable, by everything else competing for their time. And over time, that choice, it compounds, which brings this back to the original idea that yes, aging is real. There are changes that happen over time. But for most people, that's not what is driving the decline that they experience. What's driving it is that loss of structure, the loss of consistency. And the good news is those are things that you can control. If you maintain some level of structure in your training, if you continue to lift and exercise to build your conditioning, continue to move throughout the day, if you treat your body like something that still needs to perform, then there's no reason you can't be stronger, leaner, and more capable at 40 than you were at 25. It's not because you're ignoring aging, but because you're not letting it dictate the outcome. And that's really the takeaway. Aging might nudge things in a certain direction, but how you live determines where you end up. That's it for today's episode of the Everyday Strength Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, hit that subscribe button. Whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on Apple or Spotify, drop a comment on YouTube or leave a quick 5-star review on your podcast app. It helps the show reach more everyday athletes who train the right way. For weekly performance tools, training insights, and deeper breakdowns on strength, conditioning, physiology, and just becoming a better overall everyday athlete, join the free Performance Edge Network. You'll get the weekly newsletter with the topics I'm exploring, the experiments I'm running, and the practical takeaways that you can apply right away. And if you're ready to train with structure, check out my programs. Peak Performance is the flagship for building elite strength and conditioning. Peak 3X is the 3-day per week version for athletes who need maximum efficiency. And I've got programs centered around hybrid performance, running, and just becoming a stronger, more capable everyday athlete. You can find all of these programs at hagleystrength.com. I appreciate you listening. Keep showing up, keep working hard, and I'll see you in the next one.